Salut French students, comment allez-vous? Ça va? As you will remember from last time in video 7, we learned many of these mots interrogatifs. In fact, they were referred to as, let's just backtrack here for just a second. If we go a little bit further back to our previous topic, we learned them through the context of la journée, so talking about things that you would typically do in your day, especially if you are a college student. So we learned about all of these different question words and expressions that you see in bold print on those slides. So this slide, les mots interrogatifs, is basically a summary of all of those different question words that you learned about in our previous video. So it's kind of a nice one to take a look at just to make sure that you know what all the question words are, what they mean, and how they're used in a question. So they're to ask for information like who, what, when, where, even how, which we'll see a little bit further down here, and why. I learned those as a kid as the question words or the journalist questions. And they're really useful even for other subjects, actually, like writing an essay and brainstorming. If you ask yourself all those questions about a topic, they're really helpful for coming up with good ideas. So we know that these are definitely more detailed questions. You'll get more information by asking these questions than just asking a simple est-ce que kind of question, which would be yes or no. So où, if you remember, is where. So we can ask où est-ce que vous étudiez? So where do you study? Que, and que with the apostrophe or the apostrophe when the E is kind of blending into a word that begins with a vowel. This would be what? And the question we see here is qu'est-ce que vous étudiez? Okay, so we're just basically swapping out one question word for another one. The first question asked, where do you study? And the second question is asking, what do you study? Okay, so it's basically the same as in English. And we easily swap out question words there to get different pieces of information. Okay, pourquoi, you've probably heard this word somewhere before, maybe even used in English sometimes just for fun. Pourquoi means why. Okay, so pourquoi est-ce que vous étudiez le français? The same, basically the same words in this question. Again, we've just swapped out où and que for pourquoi. So why do you study French? Or why are you studying French? Or why do you study French? It can mean any of those things. Okay, we can also bring in the word quand. So if you remember from our previous video, quand means when. So if I stick that on the front of my question, now I have when do you study? Okay, I can also say avec qui, which means with whom. And it's kind of an old rule in English. I don't think people follow it too much anymore. But whenever we have a preposition like with, and prepositions are basically words that show direction or our relationship with objects in our environment. Whenever a pronoun follows a preposition, it's going to be in a certain form. There's a whole big explanation behind that. But when it comes to who or whom, generally, whom is the one that should follow a preposition. But like I said, we don't follow that rule in English too much anymore. It's kind of old-fashioned, I think. But it basically would translate to who do you study with? Okay? And then the next word we see here is comment, which would be how. So, comment est-ce que vous passez la journée? I could even ask, comment est-ce que vous étudiez le français? How do you study French? Okay, that would be a valid question. Okay, quel jour? So, quel is like which or what, but I think in this case we could translate it as which. So, which days are you in class? Quel jour est-ce que vous êtes en cours? And then finally, à quelle heure? So at what time, or at what hour, literally. So at what time are you in class? Or à quelle heure est-ce que vous étudiez le français? Okay, I could basically take any of these question words and plug it into the same question and ask for a different piece of information. So I think they're pretty easy to use. Okay, so you might have noticed, and I mentioned before, that que becomes que without the E on the end, an apostrophe instead, before a vowel sound. but there is no elision with qui, and I think that's just because of the way the vowels sound when they come next to each other. K is kind of a looser vowel sound. Qui is kind of a tighter, more tense vowel sound, so it's easier to distinguish that sound before another vowel sound than k is, I think. Okay, parce que follows the same rule. It becomes parce que with the apostrophe, the apostrophe, before vowels and silent H. So, qu'est-ce que tu aimes faire le soir? J'aime sortir. So, what do you like to do in the evening? I like to go out. J'aime sortir. Avec qui est-ce que tu aimes sortir? So, notice this one does not have an elision like that. J'aime sortir avec Paul parce qu'il est amusant. Okay, so I like to go out with Paul because he is fun. Okay, so noticing how basically the difference between que and qui and how it works with the word that comes after it. Okay. All right, so we wouldn't use est-ce que with qui when it's the subject of the verb, or with ou or comment when they're followed directly by a form of the verb être. So, qui travaille avec toi? Who works with you? So basically, qui is like the subject, the actor of that question. So who works with you? Who is basically what's doing something there. Oh, où est la bibliothèque? Where is the library? And so I'm using where kind of like the subject of the question. Comment est l'université? Where is the university? And I think our questions function in the same way with those words in English. Okay, qui est is used to ask who someone is. So qui est? C'est Jean. And remember, c'est is going to be used with a noun or a person coming after it. Qui est? C'est Jean. Okay, qu'est-ce que c'est? It's like basically asking, what is it? Okay, so what? Qu'est-ce que c'est? Qu'est-ce que is like what, and c'est is like it is. So what is it? C'est un livre. It is a book. Okay, so a couple of other different ways to use question words there. The other topic that we're going to look at with questions, coming into our second topic here, is going to be les questions par inversion. And what this means is we're talking about inverting words. And we kind of do this in English too with just one verb, with be verbs. So I can say, you are happy, and to make a question out of that, I would ask, are you happy? All I did was switch the subject and the verb to create a question. And we really can only do that with be verbs, like is, are, was, etc. We can't do it with other verbs in English. It doesn't really sound right. If I said, you work there, I can't ask, work you there? No, I have to say, do you work there? So we use do or does or did to form questions with all other verbs in English except for be verbs. But in French, it's a little bit different. You actually can reverse the order of your subject and verb with lots of verbs and get a question. So we already know that you can ask a question with rising intonation or est-ce que, and inversion is the other way that you can do this. So the question, est-ce que tu travailles le lundi? Do you work Monday? I can forget all about using est-ce que, and I can just flip tu travailles, and I can also form a question. So, travailles-tu le lundi? And it's the same question. They are equal to each other. Okay, and let's say that I have a question where I have a conjugated verb and an infinitive verb, like tu aimes aller au cinéma. So, tu aimes is the conjugated verb. Aller is the infinitive. So, do you like to go to the movies? So, instead of saying est-ce que tu aimes aller au cinéma? I can also say, aimes-tu aller au cinéma? It's just a different way of doing it. Or, voudriez-vous aller danser? I could flip it and say, est-ce que vous voudriez aller danser? Would you like to dance? Voudriez means would like. Now, that's not a verb form we've seen up to now, I don't believe. But I can also invert it and say, voudriez-vous aller danser? Would you like to dance? Okay, we can't use est-ce que and inversion in the same question, though. You have to pick one or the other. So, joues-tu de la guitare? Or, est-ce que tu joues de la guitare? Or I can just use intonation and say, tu joues de la guitare? Okay, and usually we don't use inversion with je, the subject pronoun for I. So it's with all the other forms, but not usually with je. Okay, looking at this in a little bit more depth. Okay, if I want to do inversion with il, elle, or on, those are the third person singular pronouns, and the verb ends in a vowel, okay, I have to add another sound in between for it to make sense. So if my statement is il parle anglais, he speaks English, and I want to invert it, what happens? It will sound like parle-il anglais? It sounds a little strange because there's nothing to break up the vowel sounds there. So I have to put the t in the middle so that it's easy to understand. Parle-t-il anglais? The same thing with elle travaille ici. Okay, if I try to invert it, it's going to be travaille elle ici, and it sounds kind of like the same sounds melding together in the middle, so I have to put the T to break it up. Travaille-t-elle ici? Okay, or on parle français ici? So we speak French here. Again, if I invert it, it would be like parlons français ici. We can't really distinguish which word is which, so to make it easier to understand, we have to say parle-t-on français ici? Okay. Or let's say I'm inverting il est d'ici. Here it's pretty easy because we can basically do a liaison between the T at the end of a. It's normally silent, but we can make it sound. So il est d'ici becomes est-il d'ici, or elle est d'ici becomes est-elle d'ici, or on est près de chez moi becomes est-on près de chez moi. Okay, so we just pronounce the T when we invert that form of être. Okay, so generally you're just going to invert subject pronouns like tu, il, elle, on, nous, vous, but we're not going to be doing that with actual nouns like we see here le prof or les cours, Marie, Ophélie et Juliette. Okay, if the subject of the question is a noun instead of a pronoun, you basically just state the noun first and then you can do the inversion after that. So instead of saying just est-il français, maybe you want to give a little more context to the situation and specify who il refers to. You can say le prof est-il français? It's like saying the professor, is he French? We do that in conversation in English all the time. We might supply a subject and then kind of ask a question about that subject right after. Or Marie parle-t-elle français? So it's like, Marie, does she speak French? Or les cours sont-ils difficiles? Oh, the classes, are they difficult? Ophélie et Juliette, étudient-elles ici? So I'm asking Ophélie et Juliette, do they study here? Okay, so it might seem like a lot to remember, a lot to digest, but I think if you basically remember that you can take a subject and a verb, you can flip them and create a question, but you have to be careful with il, elle, and on because you have to add that extra T sound in the middle so that it's still understandable, comprehensible. Okay, and remember that if you have a noun as your subject, you've still got to use a pronoun that refers back to that subject when you ask a question. It's basically like providing extra clarification to the listener. Okay, and then if you have an expression like il y a, you might remember that il y a means there is or there are. So to do an inversion of il y a, we're going to say y a-t-il. Oh, y a-t-il un café dans le quartier? Oh, is there a cafe in the neighborhood? Or c'est becomes es, kind of like esque, right? So, est-ce un bon café? Oh, is it a good cafe? Okay, and then to ask information questions, you're going to put the question word before the inverted verb. So if you want to add a question word to your inverted question, voudrais-tu aller? That would be, would you like to go? But if you want to make it more specific, then you can put où in front of your inversion. You can say, où voudrais-tu aller? Where would you like to go? Okay, voudrais-tu faire is you would like to do. Okay, that probably wouldn't make sense on its own, so you do have to add a question word here. Que voudrais-tu faire? So what would you like to do? And then finally, aimes-tu faire? Aim-tu faire wouldn't make sense by itself. It would be like you like to do. We need more information there. So I can add que to the front, and since aime begins with a vowel, I'm going to use the form with the apostrophe. So qu'aimes-tu faire? What do you like to do? Okay, so this covers a little bit more about questions. We learned about, or we did a good review of all of the question words, les mots interrogatifs, that they all ask for very specific information in a question. We learned all about inversion, the different ways that you can do it. In a nutshell, it's basically just reversing the order of the subject and the verb. We do this very little in English, only for forms of be, but in French you can do it for lots of verbs. If you're using il, elle, or on, you have to be careful about adding an extra T sound in between your inverted forms. And then finally, il y a and se have their own special forms of inversion. And if you want to add some or ask for some extra information in your question, then you can just add the question word before your inversion. And that's a handy way to ask a question efficiently. Okay, so the last video this week we'll be looking at au café. So we'll be learning some vocabulary words for ordering food in a cafe or a restaurant. And finally, we'll get to the numbers from 60 to 100. So we're moving up in the world. Okay, so that's it for this video. Look forward to one more video this week on perhaps tomorrow or Friday by the latest. And that will wrap it up for chapitre 2. Have a great night. Bonne nuit.